If you've ever typed something into Claude and you've received a response that was pretty close, but just wasn't quite right, or maybe it was way off from what you were looking for, I want to show you something that the Anthropic team put out. Now, this was actually put out a little over a year ago, but I saw this recently reposted on X. And I think it's worth revisiting because the Anthropic team goes over a lot of the key components that go into better prompting that I think a lot of times we don't think about them, or we just kind of need a refresher course on what makes good prompt engineering. Because keep in mind, prompt engineering is a relatively new discipline, and it's only going to become more important as LLMs get more and more advanced. Most of us were never actually taught to communicate with these models. We were just kind of given these models, and then we have to figure out how to talk to them. This information is straight from the horse's mouth. This is directly from Anthropic, so I think there's a lot of useful tidbits here. Now, they were demonstrating this as they were building an AI tool for a Swedish insurance company. It was something that could look at a car accident report, and it could hand draw the sketches of the accident and determine who is at fault. And this is, of course, very useful for legal purposes. Now, when they gave Claude a bare bones version of the prompt, Claude thought this was a ski accident. So it was pretty far off on that one. And this is because nothing in the prompt gave Claude that initial context that it needed, right? They didn't specify that it was going to be looking at vehicle insurance documents. So Claude naturally makes its best guess based on the limited information you're providing it. That's not a Claude failure, that's just a prompting failure. So here's the 10-point prompt structure that the Claude team talks about. The first thing you want to do is give Claude task context. Now, it's not just what do I want you to do, but what role is Claude going to be playing for you? What environment are you working in? And why does this task exist? Why is it important? So in the insurance example, they rewrote the prompt to say something like, you're an AI assistant helping a human claims adjuster at a Swedish car insurance company review accident report forms. Then suddenly Claude doesn't have to do as much guessing because it has that initial context to work from. And right next to that, you want to set tone and behavior. Now, this is especially important depending on the industry you're in and the purpose of the output, right? So if you're in a high stakes industry, we call it an SEO, like your money or your life type industry that deals with finance or law, you want to make sure that the Claude bot understands that, right? You want to make sure that it's going to provide this information either confidently, cautiously, or maybe somewhere in between. So in this specific case, they told it to stay factual. And if you can't make a clear determination from the provided data, feel free to say so. Do not guess. Now, that one instruction completely changed the outputs. Claude stopped hedging endlessly and started either giving a clear verdict or clearly flagging that the data wasn't sufficient. Either way, it gave it a very concrete response, which is what's required in this kind of scenario. The next area is background knowledge. Now, I think background knowledge is probably one of the most underused levers when it comes to prompting. If there's stable context, like stuff that won't change from query to query, you put it in the system prompt. But in the insurance demo, the accident report form was always the same 17-point checklist, essentially. So they just had to describe the form once in the system prompt with all 17 fields explained. And then from that point on, Claude never had to figure out what the form was about. It already knew, and it was able to deliver on that. This also saved tokens. It saved time, and it dramatically improved the accuracy of the output. So if you're building something in the API, this is also a perfect candidate for prompt caching. The next item is dynamic content. Now, this is the stuff that can change. So the specific form, the specific sketch, the specific document the user is handing you, this obviously will change. Whereas the previous elements that are just the points of the checklist that you're going to go through, that might stay the same. So this goes in the user message versus the prompt message, which we described before. And for that, you want to wrap it in XML tags so that Claude knows exactly what it's looking at. Something like accident report, wrapping the form image, or accident sketch, wrapping the drawing, a clean labeled, easy to reference format. And you can even have Claude create this for you to give to Claude, right? You could input the information that you're trying to wrap in the XML tags, and it can give you that output. Or a JSON output, whatever output you're trying to use, ultimately, it can do that for you. This is also useful, by the way, if you're using an automation system like an N8N or a Make or a Zapier. Being able to convert content into JSON or XML tags can be a really useful universal language for putting through automation workflows. Next, we have the step-by-step instructions, and specifically the order of those steps matters a lot. So the Anthropic team here, they found that telling Claude how to analyze something and in what sequence made a gigantic difference to the overall output. So in their example, they told Claude, First, read the form carefully and list every checked box. So this way you're kind of overseeing things and making sure Claude understands what is being asked of it from the get-go. And that sequencing actually mirrors how a human expert would approach the problem. Like a hand-drawn accident sketch by itself is just a bunch of lines and boxes, but if you already know from the form that vehicle A went straight and vehicle B turned left at an intersection, suddenly that sketch becomes interpretable. And so the order of analysis matters a lot. You also want to give Claude reasoning guidelines. So these are basically rules for how it should handle uncertainty. You tell it to cite specific evidence when making a claim. Let's tell it that if something is illegible, for example, or ambiguous, you got to say so. You don't want to invent new details. Now, this is how you prevent hallucination in practical applications, not through some magic modeling setting, but through explicit instruction. Then there are examples, what the AI world calls few-shot prompting. So this is one of the most important things you can do. If you have a handful of real-world cases where you know the right answer, including those in the system prompt, you input, output, and you're done. The Anthropic team pointed out that in a real insurance application, you'd probably have tens or even hundreds of hard cases. And the gray areas where a human had to make a judgment call, and baking those into the system prompt as examples, it gives Claude something to reason from when it hits a similar situation again. You can even include images as base 64 encoded data in the examples if your task involves visual outputs. This is also really good for content creation too. If you're creating content for a website and you have very specific examples out there that you're trying to emulate, let's say you have a new brand and you have this other brand that you've been looking at for a while and you love their writing style and you think it's great, you can feed all those examples into Claude and you have that pre-training built in so that it will create similar style and a similar toned output as those examples. Now, toward the end of your prompt, you want a task reminder. Now, this is meant to be just a short section that restates the most critical rules. Why? Because long prompts can dilute emphasis. If you told Claude something important in point 3, but point 10 has a list of instructions and an output format and a bunch of data, there's a real risk that early instruction you provided gets de-weighted. So repeating the key constraint at the end, quote, only assess fault if you're highly confident, cite specific form fields to support any factual claim. This helps keep Claude anchored and give you better outputs. And that leads us to the output format. So if you want something structured, a JSON object, a specific XML tag, maybe just a one quick sentence without any sort of fluff or explanation around it, you need to tell Claude exactly what you want, how you want it wrapped. And to do this, the team showed how they used a final verdict XML tag to extract just the determination from Claude's full reasoning process, which made it easy to parse programmatically. And like I said before, if you're running automations like N8N, this is a great way to get perfect. And like I said before, if you're running automations like N8N, this is a great way to get that ideal output that can then be transferred into other tools and other formats. Now, I've also included a visual Claude prompting guide in the description of this video. So look in there, there's a link to this visual. It goes over a lot of the elements that I discussed in the video. And yeah, guys, if you found this content useful, hit the like button, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.